Hello, everyone. In times like these, there needs to be some levity, so I'm wearing a mask and feeling like a cowboy. Both of my daughters are cowgirls. My daughter Rachel's in New York, and this is a tribute to her and her friends who design costumes and use fabric. They're designing masks for people to use. Rachel has donated some fabric, and that's what they're doing to help with the crisis in New York, which is at its height right now. So I will bring this down to tell you the story, but I just wanted to pay tribute to my older daughter Rachel and my younger daughter Abigail, who's working in Baltimore in a hospital with babies. And she reported the other night there was a woman who had the virus, who had a newborn in the NICU, and she wasn't expected to survive. So this plague is touching us everywhere. Tonight I'm going to tell you a wonderful story, and we will continue from there. And then I will show you some things from last time to remind you what's going on both at tea time and here. I've been trying to learn to read from nature, not just from books. And I will tell you of a discovery I made today and talk with you a bit at the end. So tonight, I'll pull it down a bit. Chapter 17, The Hunting of the White Stag. The battle was over a few minutes after their arrival. Most of the enemy had been killed in the first charge of Aslan and his companions. And when those who were still living saw that the witch was dead, they either gave themselves up or took to flight. The next thing that Lucy knew was that Peter and Aslan were shaking hands. How about that? It was so strange to her to see Peter looking as she looked now. As he looked now, his face was so pale and stern, and he seemed so much older. It was all Edmund's doing, Aslan, Peter was saying. We'd have been beaten if it hadn't been for him. The witch was turning our troops into stone, right and left, but nothing would stop him. He fought his way through 3 ogres to where she was just turning one of your leopards into a statue. And when he reached her, he had the sense to bring his sword smashing down on her wand instead of trying to go for her directly and simply getting made a stone statue himself for his pains. That was a mistake all the rest were making. Once her wand was broken, we began to have a chance. If we hadn't lost so many already, we would have. He was terribly wounded. We must go and see him. They found Edmund in charge of Mrs. Beaver a little way back from the fighting line. He was covered with blood. His mouth was open and his face nasty green color. "Quick, Lucy," said Aslan. And then, almost for the first time, Lucy remembered the precious cordial she'd been given her for a Christmas present. Her hands trembled so much that she could hardly undo the stopper, but she managed it in the end and poured a few drops into her brother's mouth. "There are other people wounded," said Aslan, while she was looking eagerly into Edmund's pale face and wondering if the cordial would have any result. "Yes, I know," said Lucy crossly. "Wait a minute." "Daughter of Eve," said Aslan in a graver voice, "others are also at the point of death. Must more people die for Edmund?" "I'm sorry, Aslan," said Lucy, getting up and going with him. And for the next half hour they were busy, she attending to the wounded while he restored those who'd been turned into stone. When at last she was free to come back to Edmund, she found him standing on his feet, not only healed of his wounds, but looking better than she had seen him look for ages. In fact, ever since his first term at that horrid school, which was where he had begun to go wrong. He had become his real old self again and could look you in the face. How about that? And there on the field of battle, Aslan made him a knight. Does he know, whispered Lucy to Susan, what Aslan did for him? Does he know what the arrangement with the witch really was? Hush, no, of course not, said Susan. Oughtn't he be told? Said Lucy. Oh, surely not, said Susan. It would be too awful for him. Think how you'd feel if you were he. All the same, I think he ought to know, said Lucy. But at that moment they were interrupted. That night they slept where they were. How Aslan provided food for them all, I don't know. But somehow or other they found themselves all sitting down on the grass to a fine high tea at about 8 o'clock. Next day began marching eastward down the side of the great river. And the next day after that, at about tea time, they actually reached the mouth. The castle of Cair Paravel on its little hill towered up above them. Before them were the sands with rocks and little pools of salt water and seaweed, and the smell of the sea and long miles of bluish-green waves breaking forever and ever on the beach. Don't you wish you were there right now? I do. And oh, the cry of the seagulls. Have you heard it? Can you remember? That evening after tea, the 4 children all managed to get down to the beach again and get their shoes and stockings off and feel the sand between their toes. But the next day was more solemn. For then in the great hall of Cair Paravel, that wonderful hall with the ivory roof, and the west wall hung with peacock's feathers, and the eastern door which looked toward the sea, in the presence of all their friends, and to the sound of trumpets, Aslan solemnly crowned them and led them to the 4 thrones, among deafening shouts of, "Long live King Peter! Long live Queen Susan! Long live King Edmund! Long live Queen Lucy!" Once a king or queen in Narnia, always a king or queen. "Bear it well, sons of Adam, bear it well, daughters of Eve," said Aslan. And through the eastern door, which was wide open, came the voices of the mermen and the mermaids swimming close to the shore and singing in honor of their new kings and queens. So the children sat on thrones, and scepters were put into their hands, and they gave rewards and honors to all their friends, to Tumnus the fawn, and to the beavers, and giant Rumblebuffin, to the leopards, and the good centaurs, and the good dwarfs, and to the lion. And that night there was a great feast in Cair Paravel, and revelry and dancing, and gold flashed and wine flowed, and answering to the music inside, but stranger, sweeter, and more piercing came the music of the sea people. But amid all those rejoicings, Aslan himself quietly slipped away. And when the kings and queens noticed that he wasn't there, they said nothing about it. For Mr. Beaver had warned them, "He'll be coming and going," he had said. "One day you'll see him and another you won't. He doesn't like being tied down, and of course he has other countries to attend to. So it's quite all right. He'll often drop in, only you mustn't press him. He's wild, you know, a lot like the tame lion." Remember the tame lion who was turned into stone, and when Aslan touched him and healed him, his white stone melted and gold flowed from his skin and then from the gold hair. It's a good story that we need to talk about. And now as you see, this story is nearly but not quite And now as you see, this story is nearly but not quite at the end. These 2 queens and kings governed Narnia well, and long and happy was their reign. At first, much of their time was spent in seeking out the remnants of the White Witch's army and destroying them. And indeed, for a long time, there would be news of evil things lurking in the wilder parts of the forest and hunting there and killing there. A glimpse of a werewolf one month, a rumor of a hag the next. But in the end, all that foul brood was stamped out. And they made good laws and kept the peace and saved good trees from being unnecessarily cut down, and liberated young dwarfs and young satyrs from being sent to school, and generally stopped busybodies and interferers and encouraged ordinary people who wanted to live and let live. And they drove back to the fierce giants, quite a different sort from giant Rumblebuffin on the north of Narnia, when those ventured across the frontier. And they entered into friendship and alliance with countries beyond the sea, and paid them visits of state and received visits of state from them. And they themselves grew and changed as the years passed over them, and Peter became a tall, deep-chested man and a great warrior. He was called King Peter the Magnificent. Susan grew into a tall and gracious woman with black hair that fell almost to her feet. And the kings of countries beyond the sea began to send ambassadors asking for her hand in marriage. And she was called Susan the Gentle. Edmund was graver and quieter man than Peter, and great in counsel and judgment. He was called King Edmund the Just. But as for Lucy, she was always gay and golden hair, and all the princes in those parts desired her to be their queen. And her own people called her Queen Lucy the Valiant. So they lived in great joy, and if ever they remembered their life in this world, it was only as one remembers a dream. In 1 year it fell out that Tumnus, who was a middle-aged faun by now and beginning to be stout, came down river and brought them news that the white stag had once more appeared in his parts. The white stag who would give you wishes if you caught him. So these 2 kings and 2 queens with the principal members of their court rode a hunting with horns and hounds in the western woods to follow the white stag. And they had not hunted long before they had sight of him. And he led them to a great pace over rough and smooth, through thick and thin, till the horses of all the courtiers were tired out, and only those 4 were still following. And they saw the stag enter into a thicket where their horses could not follow. Then said King Peter, for they talked in quite a different style now, having been kings and queens for so long, "Fair consorts, let us now alight from our horses and follow this beast into the thicket, for in all my days I have never hunted a nobler quarry." "Sir," said the others, "even so let us do." So they alighted and tied their horses to trees and went into the thick wood on foot. As soon as they had entered it, Queen Susan said, "Fair friends, here is a great marvel, for I have seemed to see a tree of iron." "Madam," said King Edmund, "if you look well upon it, you shall see it is a pillar of iron with a lantern set on the top thereof." "By the lion's mane, a strange device," said King Peter, "to set a lantern here where the trees cluster so thick about it and so high above it. If it were lit, it should give light to no man." "Sir," said Queen Lucy, "by likelihood when this post and this lamp were ever set there, were smaller trees in the place, or fewer or none. For this is a young wood, and the iron post is old." And they stood looking upon it. Then said King Edmund, "I know not how it is, but this lamp on the post worketh upon me strangely. It runs in my mind that I have seen the like before, as it were in a dream, or in the dream of a dream." "Sir," they answered all, "so it is even so with us also." And more, said Queen Lucy, for it will not go out of my mind that if we pass this post and lantern, either we shall find strange adventures or some great change for our fortunes. Madam, said King Edmund, the like foreboding stirreth in my heart also. And in mine, fair brother, said King Peter. And in mine, said Queen Susan. Wherefore, by my counsel, we shall lightly return to our horses and follow the white stag no further. Madam, said King Peter, therein I pray thee to have me excused. For never once before were kings and queens in Narnia have we set our minds to any high matter, as battles, quests, feat of arms, acts of justice, and the like, and then given over. But always what we have taken in hand, the same we have achieved. Sister, said Queen Lucy, my royal brother speaks rightly, and it seems to me we should be shamed if for any fearing or foreboding we turn back from following so noble a beast as we now have in chase. And so say I, said King Edmund, and I have such a desire to find the signification of this thing that I would not by my goodwill turn back for the richest jewel in all of Narnia or all the island. Then in the name of Aslan, said Queen Susan, if you will have it so, let us go on and take the adventure that fall to us. So these kings and queens entered the thicket, and before they had gone a score of paces, they all remembered that the thing they had seen was called a lamppost. And before they had gone 20 more, they noticed that they were making their way not through branches, but through coats. Whoop. And the next moment, they all came tumbling out of a wardrobe door into an empty room, and there were no longer kings and queens in their hunting array, but just Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy in their old clothes. It was actually the same day and the same hour of the day on which they had all gone into the wardrobe to hide. Mrs. Macready and the visitors were still talking in the passage. But luckily they never came into the empty room, so the children weren't caught. And that would have been the very end of the story if it had not been for what that they felt they must really explain to the professor why 4 of the coats out of his wardrobe was missing. And the professor, who was a very remarkable man, didn't tell them not to be silly or not to tell lies, but believed the whole story. No, he said, I don't think it will be any good trying to go back through the wardrobe door to get the coats. You won't get into Narnia again by that route. Nor would the coast be much use for you now if you did. What's that? Yes, of course you'll get back to Narnia again someday. Once a king in Narnia, always a king in Narnia. But don't go trying to use the same route twice. Indeed, don't try to get there at all. It'll happen when you're not looking for it. And don't talk too much about it even among yourselves. And don't mention it to anyone else unless you find that they've had adventures on the same sort themselves. What's that? How will you know? Oh. Thus endeth the reading of this chapter. Next time we will be going on to a bonus chapter, chapter 1 from The Horse and His Boy, and we'll continue reading. So tomorrow night at 7, The Horse, chapter 1 from The Horse and His Boy, the next book. And the chapter 1 from The Horse and His Book is titled How Shasta Set Out on His Travels. So we'll be talking about that tomorrow. It's so good to have you all here. And I would like once more to go over a few things that I did today. And again, what I mentioned last night. As I mentioned yesterday, I've been trying to learn from nature as well as books. And on my walks, I collected these a few days ago to to symbolize the loved ones that we love and those who are perishing, both living and dead, and the people that we should pray for while this scourge continues. This bowl, again, was a gift from my friend, and it capsulizes especially the lion being turned from stone by Aslan into living flesh. And as you see, there was gold that poured out from the white stone, and then hair descended and living flesh. That's a parable and really a simile for us coming into our true selves, and it's something that I think we should deal with and can, and I will explain it more later tonight. And then remember, I found this stone again, which on it had on this side, to me, a symbol of all of our relationships in God. And I thought of two friends as well as my other friends, some who have 2 children, some who have 3, but it all flows from the same source. And when I got it and brought it here, I turned the end of the rock up, and look what it is. It forms the Holy Trinity. The same rock, it's the same looking rock that's at the foot of the cross at the Recovery Center I've been telling you about. And I will show it to you if I can. Tonight, I found another rock, and I did some research because I'm trying to learn from nature, as I mentioned, from Wordsworth, and we'll be continuing to talk about the painting above the fireplace called Shell and Stone in the future. But next week for Easter, if I can arrange it, we'll be looking at ancient symbols as expressed inside the interior and the exterior of the church across the street. And I will be explaining the symbolism of the bridge at Glenfeather Hallows. But I found this rock yesterday and I brought it home today, and I'm returning it to the place it was found. It's in a drainage ditch right under the wonderful place I described last night and yesterday as the grass of the fields waving in the wind. And it's moss growing on a rock, and that's what we can do while we're locked up inside, or we can serve others and do things for others. Say, for instance, like making these handkerchiefs and masks. So I looked up, just for fun, I looked up things about moss and stone and grass. And part of our Mud-Eye Design Creative is studying moss and its effects in the garden. So I'm looking at popular quotes. In the UK, a rolling stone gathers no moss. Gathers moss, that notion was known to the ancient world, and the Greek and Latin versions of the phrase are cited by Erasmus in the 3rd volume of his collection. It's been identified with the Rolling Stones. The phrase is, a rolling stone gathers no moss. And when the grass starts to grow, I'll back up and say, well, I told you so. A rolling stone gathers no moss. There's a daily news service that says, the gathers is the word gadir. It's looks like it's Celtic. Means to collect. And I gathered some firewood for the camp, like moss. Today we explained a very whole, this is a very old saying that has a lot to do with rock and roll. Anyway, all I'm saying is don't let moss grow on your rocks, and find ways that you can love and reach out to others in our isolation. It's really important, and it's really a wonderful way to share love. Tomorrow, for tea time, I will be beginning to tell you about Holy Week and be exploring symbols of that. And tomorrow's Sunday with relics, more or less. And then on Monday, or tomorrow night at 7, we'll start the next chapter, the first chapter of the boy. Thank you all for being with me tonight, and thank you for indulging me in my Western collection and reflection. And God bless all of you who are serving others and serving those who are sick. And please, everyone, pray tonight for protection for those who are helping the ill. Have a good evening. Love being with you. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow at 3 and at 7. Good night.